It was one of those winter nights that felt older than the season itself, the kind where the air tastes like metal and the wind seems to carry stories you'd rather not hear. Fernwood, a small suburb on the edge of Melbourne, slept under a thin blanket of fog. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the smell of it clung to the fences, the eaves, the earth. Inside a modest brick house on Mayfair Street, a mother and daughter slept. Marina Harper, 34. Sophie Harper, 9. Their world was small, safe, and quiet, or at least it seemed to be. The television was still faintly glowing in the living room, its blue light fading across an armchair. A mug of cold chamomile tea sat half-finished on the counter. In the corner of the kitchen, a leaky tap dripped at uneven intervals, steady enough to sound like a clock, but irregular enough to unsettle you once you noticed it. That's the kind of night it was. Ordinary, but uneasy. Sometime between midnight and dawn on August 7th, 1984, an intruder slipped into that house. No forced entry, no broken glass. The back door's lock, the one Marina had meant to fix, was useless. Whoever entered knew the way in. Police would later theorize that the killer didn't stumble upon the Harpers by chance. They believed he'd watched them before, maybe seen Marina come home from her nursing shifts, tired, distracted, balancing groceries in Sophie's school bag. Maybe he'd noticed that the curtains never quite closed all the way. He didn't break in. He just came in. In the darkness of the small bedroom, Marina stirred once. Maybe she heard the floorboards creak. Maybe she thought it was Sophie turning in her sleep. But it wasn't. The rest, no one can say for sure. There were no screams heard by neighbors, no calls for help. Just the quiet violence of something that happened between the rhythm of two breaths. By the time the morning came, Fernwood had no idea that its peace had been broken forever. It was around 10 a.m. when Marina's brother, Ian, stopped by the house to return a film reel they'd borrowed the previous weekend. A family habit, swapping old movies, laughing about their scratched tapes and fading soundtracks. He parked in the driveway, saw the curtains still drawn, and thought they must be sleeping in. But when he noticed the back door ajar, something cold moved through him. I remember thinking, maybe they forgot to latch it, he later told police. He knocked softly. Marina? No answer. He stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender detergent and something else. Something wrong. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps careful, uncertain. The living room was untouched. The kettle sat on the stove, nothing out of place. Then he reached the bedroom. Two shapes under the blanket. Still. Too still. He called out again, voice cracking, but the silence that followed was absolute. When the police arrived minutes later, they found the bodies of Marina and Sophie Harper lying side by side. The mother, her arm stretched slightly toward her daughter. The daughter, tucked under the quilt as though still asleep. Both had been strangled with a length of rope, the kind you might use in a garage or the trunk of a car. Sophie had been sexually assaulted. The back door was unlocked. The kitchen window left half open. No fingerprints, no footprints, except one partial tread in the damp earth outside the step from what looked like a size 9 Dunlop Volley sneaker. A detective, decades later, would describe that moment as the kind of silence that never leaves you. And that's the thing about cases like this. It's not just the brutality. It's the way time seems to stop inside those walls, The way the clock above the kitchen counter keeps ticking, unaware that its house is no longer a home. By noon, the small street of Mayfair was swarming with officers and forensic teams. Reporters gathered behind the police tape, their microphones trembling in the wind. One neighbor said she saw a red utility vehicle parked across the street late the night before, headlights off, engine idling. Another said she'd heard footsteps on gravel sometime around 2 a.m. But no one saw the face. The crime would soon dominate headlines across Victoria. Mother and daughter slain in Fernwood home. A line that doesn't begin to describe the loss it carried. That day, a detective named Alan Fraser, the lead investigator, stood in the front yard of the Harper house, his breath fogging in the cold. He told reporters that someone out there knows who did this, and we're going to find them. He believed it. Everyone did. At first. But as the hours turned to days and days to weeks, the certainty began to fade. In the files, it's recorded clinically: strangulation with ligature, sexual assault on minor, no sign of forced entry. But outside the ink and paper, it was chaos, a family destroyed, a community afraid, and an investigation that was about to become one of the most haunting cold cases in Australian history. That night, August 7th, 1984, would become the anchor point for every theory, every obsession, every unanswered question for nearly 40 years. And I can't help but think of the sound of that leaking tap in the kitchen, counting down the minutes between life and death. Before Fernwood became the street whispered about on nightly news bulletins, before police tape cut across its quiet lawns and neighbors turned their faces away from cameras, there was just a mother and her daughter, Marina and Sophie Harper. And for a long time, that was all they needed. Marina wasn't the kind of person who attracted attention. She was the kind who quietly held her world together, thread by thread, day by day. She worked at St. Anne's Hospital in the nursing ward, tending to patients in the late-night shifts most people avoided. Everyone said the same thing about her: steady hands, kind eyes, always tired but always there. Her colleagues remembered her as the one who remembered birthdays, who slipped a sandwich to the intern who forgot lunch, who hummed under her breath when things got tense. She had that way about her, calming, nurturing, a warmth that didn't ask to be noticed. But beneath that gentle calm was someone who carried more weight than she ever showed. Her husband had left when Sophie was 3. No great scandal, no violence, just distance that turned into silence. He moved north, found work, remarried. Marina never said a bad word about him. She only said, "Some people drift, you just keep rowing." And she did. Every morning she woke before sunrise, packed Sophie's lunch, and caught the 6:40 bus to the hospital. She'd return after dusk, exhausted, but somehow still found the energy to help Sophie with homework or read her a story before bed. The house on Mayfair Street wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, an old heater that clanked when it turned on, and a garden that never quite thrived. But Marina made it home. She hung fairy lights around Sophie's window and painted the kitchen a warm yellow, a defiance against Melbourne's gray winters. And on weekends she studied. Textbooks stacked on the table, highlighters bleeding across pages. She dreamed of switching careers, of becoming a solicitor, of helping the vulnerable she saw in hospital beds every night. Her family said she was too tired for it, too busy. But Marina had a quiet stubbornness. She believed that a better life was something you earned, not something you wished for. Sophie was 9, and in every way she was the spark that made the rest of that house glow. A bright-eyed kid who loved drawing and collecting stickers from cereal boxes, Sophie filled their small home with noise, singing, laughter, half-finished projects on the living room floor. Her teachers said she was imaginative to a fault. She could spin a fairy tale out of a math problem, and sometimes she'd write stories about her mother as a superhero who could heal people with a touch. She had long, brown hair that never stayed brushed, and a smile that was slightly crooked from a chipped tooth, the result of a playground tumble the year before. She loved fairy bread, bubblegum-flavored milk, and running barefoot in the backyard after rain. And she was brave.
in that innocent, fearless way children are before they know the world can be cruel. Sophie adored her mother. Sometimes when Marina fell asleep over her textbooks, Sophie would quietly drape a blanket over her shoulders. Mom works for everyone. She's a nurse and a lawyer. One day I'm going to help her. There was something in the way they leaned into each other, like two halves of a promise neither of them ever doubted. Fernwood was an ordinary suburb in 1984. Rows of modest homes, cars parked on driveways, dogs barking at postmen. But it had its secrets too. Every neighborhood does. There was the older man who always watched from his porch but never waved back. The young tenant who threw loud parties on weekends. The woman across the street who walked her dog at strange hours, rain or not. But mostly it was quiet. Children rode bikes. Neighbors borrowed sugar. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at dusk. And that's what makes the story hurt even more. Because this wasn't supposed to happen here. In the weeks before their deaths, Marina mentioned something odd to a colleague. A vague feeling she couldn't quite explain. She'd noticed the back gate left open twice. Once, she thought she heard footsteps on gravel while she was reading in bed, and on one occasion, she found the latch on the laundry window bent slightly. She laughed it off. She said probably just wind, or kids cutting through. But there's something haunting about hindsight. The way memory curdles when you realize what it was warning you of. One neighbor, years later, told police she had seen a man standing near the Harper fence about a week before the murders. Not close, just there, smoking, staring. She remembered it only because his face seemed oddly calm, detached, as if he wasn't really looking at anything at all.
No one could identify him. That man, whoever he was, never came forward. August 6th, 1984. A Monday. Cold, drizzling, uneventful. Marina had worked a short afternoon shift at the hospital. She came home around 5:30 p.m., picked up takeaway Chinese food, and ate dinner with Sophie in front of the television. They watched A Country Practice, Sophie's favorite show. She spoke to her brother on the phone later that night. They laughed about a family barbecue planned for the weekend. He said she sounded bright, tired, but happy. Around 9 p.m., a neighbor saw Marina taking down laundry from the back line. She waved. Marina waved back. By 10, the lights were off. That's the last confirmed sighting of them alive. And yet, I keep thinking about those final moments. How utterly normal they were. The Chinese cartons half filled, the laundry folded neatly on the chair, the way the TV glow faded out across the room. There's something chilling about the ordinary, because it makes what followed feel almost impossible. After the discovery, news crews arrived quickly. Fernwood's tranquility was gone. Journalists huddled under umbrellas, voices hushed but hungry. Inside, detectives worked quietly, careful not to look too long at the bed. The smell of lavender, detergent, and death hung in the air. Marina's law textbook was still open on the kitchen table, a chapter titled Duty of Care. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The house became a kind of tomb, sealed in time. Neighbors stood outside, shivering. Some said that Marina had a secret admirer from work. Others said she'd recently argued with a man over the phone. But much of it was rumor, born from fear. The truth was simpler and crueler. A woman and her child, alone, unprotected, and stalked by someone who saw an opportunity. People always talk about murder as if it's the event itself that defines it. The violence, the crime scene, the investigation. But in truth, it's the absence that does the haunting.
It's the cold tea on the counter. The school bag left by the door. The bed still indented on one side. For weeks, family members couldn't bear to enter the house. Marina's sister said it felt as if the walls remembered what happened, as if they exhaled sorrow. When the funeral came, hundreds filled the church. Nurses in uniform lined the aisles. Sophie's classmates carried white flowers too large for their small hands. The priest read a verse about light and innocence, but his voice trembled when he said Sophie's name. And I remember a line one detective said years later in an interview. "You work hundreds of cases, but this one never leaves you. Because it's not just that they died, it's how gentle their lives were before someone took them. That's what makes it stay. The gentleness." The world moved on, but in the quiet houses of Fernwood, mothers began checking their locks twice at night. Fathers started waiting up for their kids to come home. And even years later, when the case turned cold and the files gathered dust, people still lowered their voices when they said the name Harper. Because for all the time that passed, the question remained: who came through that door, and why? The first thing detectives noticed when they entered the Harper house was how neat everything was. No overturned furniture, no smashed windows, no forced entry. It didn't look like a break-in. It looked like someone had belonged there. Detective Alan Fraser led the investigation, a veteran of the Victoria Police with 25 years behind him, the kind of man whose patience hid beneath a hard jawline and eyes that never stopped reading the room. He stood in that narrow hallway, rain dripping from his coat, and felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name. He would later call it the hum of unfinished evil. Every corner of the small house was combed for evidence. Photographs, fibers, soil samples from the back step. In Sophie's room, forensic officers lifted the bedsheets carefully into evidence bags. In Marina's room, they found a single cigarette butt on the floor. Marina didn't smoke. Neither did Sophie. Outside, the backyard soil held a faint shoe print. Half a tread, size 9, Dunlop volley. A common shoe, the kind worn by tradesmen, students, anyone. But it was something. A neighbor described a red utility vehicle parked nearby that night. Headlights off, engine idling. Another neighbor, an elderly woman, said she'd heard gravel crunching, just one set of footsteps, between 2 and 3 a.m. But there were no witnesses to the crime. The coroner's report confirmed the horror everyone already knew. Both victims had been strangled with a ligature, most likely a section of rope. Sophie had been sexually assaulted. The case was classified as a double homicide, one of the worst in the state's history. For a while, it consumed everything. The Harper house became a revolving door of investigators. They mapped every square meter with chalk and photographs. They reconstructed timelines, cross-referenced call logs, interviewed coworkers, classmates, family. But no matter how many doors they knocked on, every lead dissolved into uncertainty. Marina's colleagues at St. Anne's Hospital described her as kind but private. No enemies, no bad debts, no troubled affairs. And yet, one nurse recalled something strange. 2 weeks before her death, Marina had mentioned a patient, a man who'd made her uneasy. He joked too much, asked too many personal questions. She'd told him she lived near the park, then quickly changed the subject. When police tracked him down, he had an alibi. Still, the pattern began to form. Someone had been watching the Harpers. By mid-August, the task force was working 16-hour days. Photographs of Marina and Sophie were pinned to a corkboard beside a map of Fernwood. Red string traced sightings of the mysterious utility vehicle. Every detective has one case that lives under their skin. For Alan Fraser, this became it. He stopped sleeping properly. He kept a copy of Sophie's school photo on his desk, a reminder of who he was fighting for. "I kept thinking," he later said, "this wasn't random. Someone targeted them. You could feel it." But the crime scene offered little to support that certainty. The rope yielded no fingerprints. The cigarette butt, no match in the database. The killer had vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but absence. Back then, DNA forensics were barely a whisper of possibility. Samples were taken, yes, biological evidence carefully stored, but the technology to decode them simply didn't exist yet. Still, the officers preserved everything. They sealed the nightdress Sophie wore, the rope fibers, the cigarette, swabs from the bedding. Decades later, those samples would become the key to reopening the case. But for now, in 1984, all they had were questions. The press turned ruthless. Police baffled in mother-daughter murders. Killers still at large, suburb terrified. Reporters followed Alan Fraser to his car. He never gave them more than a tight shake of the head. But inside, he was coming undone. He'd built a profile. A man in his 20s or 30s, physically strong, sexually motivated, perhaps local, familiar with the area. Someone who could walk those streets unnoticed. Someone who might even have known Marina through her work. But profiling doesn't bring faces, it only sharpens shadows. For months, Fernwood changed. Locksmiths couldn't keep up with demand. Parents walked their children to school. Single women moved out. And yet, the police line at the Harper House stayed in place, a reminder that the danger had already come and gone. Alan Fraser re-interviewed every friend, every colleague, every neighbor. He even went through Marina's study notes, reading her handwriting as if it might confess something she couldn't. One phrase circled in red ink caught his eye: duty of care, the responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It felt prophetic. By late 1985, the case had stalled. No new leads, no confessions, just empty files growing thicker. Fernwood went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, one edged with fear. Every few years, the police reopened the file, hoping for new technology, new tips. And then, in the early 2000s, it happened. The preserved biological evidence from Sophie's clothing was sent for advanced DNA testing. For the first time, investigators had a full profile. The results came back. A match was found. A man already serving time in prison for unrelated offenses. The task force believed briefly that they had their killer. The man was questioned, charged, even brought before court. But something went wrong, disastrously wrong.
Contamination in earlier lab handling meant that certain samples could no longer be verified. Some of the original evidence was mishandled during decades of transfers between facilities. The defense argued that nothing could prove the DNA wasn't cross-contaminated. Without certainty, the case collapsed. Charges were withdrawn. And once again, the Harper murders fell into shadow. But the cold case detectives didn't stop. In 2014, a new clue emerged from the archives, a mention of a red utility vehicle seen parked near the Harper home that night. The record had been overlooked for years, buried under hundreds of witness statements. They traced every registered red utility in the state at that time: mechanics, delivery drivers, local tradesmen. One man's name kept resurfacing. He'd lived 2 streets away from Marina, moved shortly after the murders, had a prior conviction for assault, and, most chillingly, owned a pair of Dunlop Volley sneakers. Detectives tracked him down. By then, he was old, living alone, bitter, and evasive. He denied everything, said he'd never met Marina, never owned a rope, never had a reason to be near that house. When police asked for a DNA sample, he refused. Legally, they couldn't compel him without more evidence. And so again, the door shut. I've always thought about that moment. A man sitting in a small flat, curtains drawn, an old pair of shoes under his bed, while detectives drive away knowing the truth might be only a cotton fiber out of reach. Cold cases do something to investigators. They hollow them out slowly. They make you live between what you know and what you can prove. Alan Fraser retired in the late 1990s, long before the DNA developments. But he never stopped calling the station on anniversaries, asking, "Anything new?" He died in 2006. His replacement, Detective Sergeant Linda Kerr, took up the file. She described it as a ghost I couldn't let go of. Every photo she looked at, every report she read, seemed to whisper the same thing. He was someone they knew. Because nothing about the scene felt like the work of a stranger breaking in to kill. It felt intimate, controlled, personal. Someone had stood in that doorway and looked at Marina Harper and knew her enough not to need words. In 2017, on the 33rd anniversary of the murders, the Victorian government announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to a conviction. It was one of the largest in the state's history. Cold case detectives held a press conference. Behind them stood enlarged photos of Marina and Sophie, forever frozen in their final smiles. Reporters asked the same question: "Do you believe the killer is still alive?" The lead investigator paused, then said softly, "Yes, and I believe someone out there knows exactly who he is." The air in that room changed. For weeks after, the tip line buzzed. Old acquaintances called in memories, half-truths, suspicions, but none led to a name. The case, once again, went cold. There's a moment in every unsolved case when the narrative stops being about evidence and starts being about belief. You stop asking what happened and start asking who remembers. Because somewhere in Fernwood or beyond it, someone does remember. Someone still dreams of rope burns, of headlights off, of footsteps on gravel. Maybe it's the man with the red utility. Maybe it's someone who saw something they weren't meant to see and convinced themselves it was nothing. But silence is a kind of guilt too. And so the question lingers, heavy as fog. Was the killer a stranger who slipped through a broken lock? Or a familiar face who smiled at Marina in passing, waved to Sophie once after school, and came back one night when the world was asleep? The police files still sit in a gray metal cabinet at Victoria Police Headquarters, marked Case 84-237, The Harpers. Inside, photographs, rope fibers, lab reports, letters from family begging for closure. I've seen copies of some of them. Each page smells faintly of dust and rain, and when you read them, you can almost feel the cold that night all over again. The kind of cold that doesn't go away because it's not weather, it's memory. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the way we hope it will. Sometimes it never comes at all. But stories like Marina and Sophie Harper's don't fade, they wait. They live in photographs and police files, in the way strangers still pause when they pass the old house on Mayfair Street. Because even after 40 years, that little home still stands. Different paint, new owners, children laughing in the yard. But underneath, the earth remembers.
For decades, the Harper family carried on as best they could. Marina's brother Ian, the man who found them that morning, never moved far away. He'd visit the gravesite every year, fresh lilies in hand, brushing away the leaves. He never gave interviews, never sought attention. But people who knew him said that after 1984, he spoke slower, as if every word had to pass through the memory of that room first. Sophie's classmates grew up, started families of their own. Some still left small notes at the cemetery each August, a scribbled, "Happy birthday, Soph," or "Still miss you." Life went on, as it always does, but it didn't move forward. It just moved around the empty space they left. The Harper murders became folklore in Fernwood, a kind of dark bedtime story that parents told their children in hushed voices. Lock the doors. Don't walk alone at night. Remember the Harpers. And yet what gets lost in those retellings is the gentleness, the real people behind the tragedy. A mother who worked double shifts to build a better life. A daughter who still slept with her favorite stuffed rabbit. That's the part the news never captures. The small human textures that made their world real before it was broken. At Victoria Police Headquarters, the Harper file sits in what detectives call the vault. A windowless archive filled with boxes that hold unsolved murders, some decades old. Every now and then, a cold case team revisits the Harper's file, lifting the lid, spreading out the photographs, breathing the dust of 1984 all over again. You can almost see it, a new detective, young, idealistic, pulling the file from the shelf, reading the details for the first time. He pauses over the crime scene photos, the shoe print, the rope. He leans back, exhales, and whispers to himself, "How did we not catch him?" They always ask that question, and they always end up at the same wall. Evidence too old, samples too fragile, memories too blurred. But every so often, technology advances. New DNA sequencing, digital analysis of fibers, methods that didn't exist even 5 years ago. And with each leap, the file glows faintly again. A name might surface, a trace might match. It hasn't happened yet. But hope in this story is its own form of persistence. Detective Sergeant Linda Kerr, who inherited the case after Alan Fraser's retirement, once described it like this. "When I think of Marina, I don't think of the case file. I think of her tea mug, the one still sitting on the counter when we found her. Half full, cold, waiting for her hand to come back." She said she kept that image in her mind whenever she worked other cases, a reminder that the people in those photos had lives before they became evidence. Over the years, Linda received hundreds of tips, anonymous calls, letters, theories. Most led nowhere. But in 2019, something unexpected arrived. A man in his 60s walked into a Melbourne police station. He claimed he had information about the man with the red utility. Said he'd known him decades ago. That he'd once boasted about a woman and a kid who wouldn't scream. Detectives checked the story. The man he'd named had died years earlier. The details were vague, unverifiable. But still, for a moment, the air in that cold case office changed. They sat in silence, listening to the old man shaping hands on the table, the sound of his breath catching as he said, "I should have come sooner." Maybe he was right. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe it would have changed everything. Every city has a house that people whisper about. In Fernwood, it was the Harpers. Even after it was sold, repainted, remodeled, locals still crossed the street when they walked past it. Children dared each other to peek through the fence. Teenagers told stories about seeing a woman's shadow in the kitchen window or hearing a girl laugh from the back garden. Superstition? Maybe. But maybe that's just how memory manifests when truth refuses to come to light. Because places hold energy. Walls remember. And that small brick house remembers more than most. One of the new owners, interviewed anonymously years later, said they hadn't known the property's history when they moved in. But one night, while unpacking, she swore she heard soft humming, a woman's voice, faint and melodic, coming from what used to be the second bedroom. When she turned on the light, there was nothing there, only a cold draft and the creak of the floorboards. She found out weeks later from a neighbor that Sophie used to hum herself to sleep. Coincidence? Maybe. But maybe not.
There's a particular cruelty in not knowing, in having to live with questions that will never answer themselves. For the Harper family, every milestone that passed was shadowed by that absence. Every birthday, every holiday, every time someone said, "Remember when?" Because remembering hurts, but forgetting feels like betrayal. In 2021, a new generation of forensic scientists reanalyzed the stored evidence, the rope fibers, the cigarette butt, the faint traces on the bedding. And while they didn't yield a full new profile, they did extract trace sequences, enough to confirm that the original DNA evidence had been mishandled decades earlier. For the investigators, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. A relief because they finally knew why the case had unraveled. A heartbreak because it meant justice might never be possible. The file remains open, officially unsolved, indefinitely active. But in the eyes of those who've carried it, it's more than just a case number. It's a wound, one the city still carries quietly, like an old scar under clothing. I've walked down Mayfair Street. It's peaceful now. Trees older, gardens tidier, life resumed. But the air there feels different, like a pause between breaths. You wouldn't know driving past that this was once a crime scene. You wouldn't feel the weight of what happened behind those walls. And yet if you stop for a moment, if you really listen, you might sense it. A quiet sadness, like something left unsaid. I stood there once, not far from the old mailbox, and thought about Marina, how she'd worked so hard for a future she never got to reach, and Sophie, how her laughter for a few years had filled that house so completely that even silence now feels shaped around it. There's a line from one of Marina's journals that was found after her death. She'd written it months before in pencil between her study notes. If I can make even one person's life better, then all this tiredness is worth it. She did that without knowing it. She made people care. Decades later, strangers still whisper her name, still tell her story, still keep her and her daughter alive in memory. And that, in its own quiet way, is a form of justice. Imagine this. It's early morning, 1984. The fog is lifting. A red utility drives slowly out of Fernwood, tires crunching against wet gravel. Inside the house, 2 cups sit on the counter, one half full of tea, one of milk. A law textbook lies open on a table under a single light bulb. And in that moment, before the sirens, before the headlines, before the decades of silence, the world was still holding its breath, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to knock, waiting for justice that never came. Because the truth about cases like this isn't just that they go unsolved. It's that they keep happening in different houses, on different nights, to different names. And each time, the silence after is the same. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet suburban street after dark, and you hear the soft hum of wind through a broken latch, remember the Harpers. Remember what it means when we stop paying attention. Because some doors, once opened, never really close.